Rising food prices have been linked with the unrest in Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. In some cases, governments around the globe have instituted price controls as a method of trying to contain rioting. Ephraim Leibtag is an economist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He studies food costs at all levels, producers, wholesalers, and retailers. Mr. Leibtag joins me from our Washington bureau. Sir, welcome to Bloomberg's Bottom Line. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Glad to be here.
Talk to us about this unrest and how, in fact, it is linked to the rising cost of food.
Well, when we look at the domestic situation in the U.S., our focus for retail prices is mostly on how commodities and global supply and demand impact food prices. And so there's a long chain of events there, but higher food prices in the U.S. are related to those higher commodity prices.
People are eventually going to be seeing these at the grocery store?
We've already started to see some signs of inflation at the retail level, and given where commodity markets are now, starting with corn, soybeans, and wheat, all the way through the system, we're going to see higher food prices and inflation accelerating over the next few months.
Is this something, I guess it's a global phenomenon and not something that's just specific to the United States, correct?
Well, with global commodity prices where they are, they're approaching those 2008 highs. We're going to see higher food prices at the retail level and for consumers in many countries, not just the U.S.
All right. You're watching this closely because the last time you were keeping an eye on this was in 2007, 2008. Are you seeing any parallels?
There are a bunch of parallels in terms of where commodity markets have gone. When we're trying to look at retail prices and where they're going to go, looking at where energy and basic commodity prices are often a good leading indicator. The links are there. There's a long process from the basic commodities to the final, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of what happened in energy markets, what happened in commodity markets, what's happening in global trade that we saw in 2008 that are starting to happen again.
Does this put producers in sort of a box here because they're eventually going to have to pass this on to consumers?
There's a challenge for wholesalers and certainly retailers right now, given that now consumers are coming out of a recession, a time when they're probably a lot more budget conscious, with the unemployment rate still relatively high. It's going to be more challenging than it was in 07 and 08 to pass those costs on, and that's probably right now the only barrier to inflation not moving towards what it was in 2008.
How do farm exports to countries like China play into all of this?
Exports of agricultural products from the U.S. elsewhere have an impact on the prices that domestic producers have to pay for the ingredients they use to produce food here. So as we export more and more, that's good for the exporters from the U.S. elsewhere, but it does make costs higher for food producers domestically.
So let's look at it from a U.S. perspective then. Is the U.S. basically still the farmer to the world?
We are a major agricultural producer, but the entire world's food production is more intertwined now with lower transportation costs historically, even though energy costs are higher now. And so what we send out elsewhere through our exports does have a big impact here as well.
Yeah, let's talk about the USDA's forecast for prices for this year. What are you seeing?
Our current forecast is for food prices to rise around 2.5% to 3%, which is a reversion from the very low inflation of the last 2 years. We update that once a month, and what's happened in the last few weeks means most likely we'll have to revisit that at the end of the month, as we normally do. Given where commodities are, I think we're going to see accelerating inflation.
And if we could keep that graphic on the screen, Mr. Leibtag, talk to me about pork, fish, and dairy in particular.
The protein products, the meat products, as well as dairy, are oftentimes impacted the most by commodities. When you talk about, let's say, corn and soybeans going into animal feed, that has an impact on costs. And the farm level and wholesale prices have already risen, in some cases, to record highs. And so that's putting pressure on the retail prices for those categories.
What do these higher food prices mean for farmers?
Well, across the supply chain, there are those that will be better off. It depends basically on how much your costs are rising versus how much higher your prices are. And that's a challenge for the meat industry when they are facing higher costs, even if they are getting higher prices.
Well, how does this affect companies like, say, for instance, Kraft? What does this mean for their bottom line?
I think that the food companies this year are going to face some challenges because, as opposed to 07, 08, they're going to have a little bit of a tougher time passing on these higher costs given consumer sentiment.
Can government do anything to ease these high prices?
I mean, my perspective as an economist is that we're looking at market forces here, and the way the global economy works, we do have additional challenges. I'm not sure if there's a role for any type of policy at this point.
Sir, when you see what's going on in places like Algeria and Tunisia and in Egypt, is this something that was developing before we saw the unrest, or has the unrest that's been happening in this nation just brought this issue front and center?
Well, I think that in developing countries, the price of basic food commodities is very central to people's well-being. In the U.S., we might, on average, spend only 10 or even 15% on food. In developing countries, it can be much higher, in some cases half of their budgets. And so for consumers and the basic person on the street, higher prices for food can be a much bigger challenge.
And Mr. Leibtag, if I might, in our last minute, I was speaking to a guest yesterday, and we were noting that in 2050 there's going to be a population explosion around the world. How do nations feed their increased population? How do they take care of their people and do it in a nutritious way?
Those are two important challenges. I think in terms of actual productivity, we've looked to technology. There have been huge increases in productivity gains in terms of the agricultural sector over the last 20 years. And then in terms of health and nutrition, that's the challenge of taking the productivity of food in general and focusing in on the foods that are the best choices for us from a health perspective.
All right, Ephraim Leibtag, economist at the Department of Agriculture Research Service, joining us from our bureau in Washington. Mr. Leibtag, thanks so much. We appreciate it.